Beneath the luminous skyline of Paris, the glittering Eiffel Tower, the ringing of church bells, the hum of late-night cafes, lies another city, one that most Parisians would rather forget. It is a world carved not by dreamers or artists, but by centuries of necessity and decay. The catacombs stretch beneath the city like a vast coiling serpent, tunnels that twist into oblivion, walls lined with bones, ceilings dripping with ancient moisture. To descend here is to step into a silence so complete that it feels alive, pressing against your ears, swallowing the rhythm of your heartbeat. Long before they became a macabre tourist attraction, these tunnels were quarries. Limestone was pulled from the ground to build the very monuments that stand proudly above the Notre Dame, the grand boulevards, the palaces of kings. But as the city grew, so did its problems. Cemeteries overflowed, the stench of decay rising through the streets, carrying disease and dread. And so, the authorities made a choice both practical and horrifying. They emptied the dead from their graves and laid them to rest in the cold embrace of the catacombs. One by one, millions of skeletons were lowered into the underworld, stacked in neat, chilling arrangements that would stretch for miles. Skulls became bricks, femurs became walls, and entire chambers were fashioned into shrines of mortality. Walking through these passages is to be confronted, not with the history of kings and revolutions, but with the history of death itself. Each row of skulls is a silent reminder of plague, famine, and forgotten war. The bones of the rich rest beside the bones of beggars, the remains of children beside soldiers, all distinctions erased by the quiet finality of the grave. The air smells of damp stone and dust, and yet there lingers an unshakable sense of presence, as though the walls themselves are listening. Tourists who wander the guided paths see only a fraction of this underground empire. They shuffled nervously behind their guides, snapping photographs, laughing too loudly to mask the tension. They see the carefully arranged ossuaries and the eerie inscriptions carved into stone. Cest, ici l'Empire de la Mort. Stop, this is the Empire of Death. But beyond the lantern-lit passages, beyond the locked gates and hidden doors, lies something else entirely. Uncharted chambers, collapsed tunnels, and sections so dangerous that even seasoned explorers refuse to map them. It is in these forbidden depths, away from the footsteps of the living, where shadows whisper and silence thickens into dread. Paris above is known for its romance and beauty, but beneath the cobblestones lurks its other half, its darker reflection. A city of bones, of echoes, of secrets too heavy for daylight, and within its heart, hidden even from those who dare to enter, waits the Chamber of Voices, a place where history does not rest in peace, but breathes. Elodie Moreau had always been different from her peers. While other historians were content to leaf through archives or pore over dusty manuscripts in quiet libraries, Elodie longed for something more visceral. History, to her, was not a collection of words and dates. It was alive, breathing just beneath the surface of the modern world. She craved to feel it, to touch it, to step into the shadows where time itself lingered. Her obsession began in childhood, when her grandfather took her on tours of Paris's old cemeteries. While most children would recoil from the sight of crumbling tombs, Elodie was transfixed. She would run her fingers over the faded inscriptions, whispering the names aloud, as though calling the dead back into existence. As she grew older, her fascination with the macabre deepened. University professors recognized her brilliance, but worried about her fixation on the darker corners of history. While her classmates wrote papers on political revolutions or architectural triumphs, Elodie devoted herself to the forgotten, the execution sites, the unmarked graves, the whispers of tragedies hidden beneath the city's glamour. Her research led her into obscure collections, brittle manuscripts, and secretive societies of cataphiles, those reckless urban explorers who dared to slip into the forbidden catacombs. It was in these circles that she first heard the name whispered like a curse. La Chambre des voiced the Chamber of Voices. Most dismissed it as myth, a legend meant to scare thrill-seekers away from venturing too deep. But one night, in the dim corner of a rare bookstore near Montparnasse, Elodie discovered something that changed everything. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with hands stained by ink, slid a journal across the counter without a word. Its cover was cracked, the pages brittle with age, yet within it lay descriptions more terrifying than any rumor she had heard. The journal belonged to a 17th century grave digger, tasked with transferring bodies into the catacombs during the city's great relocations. His words trembled with fear as he recounted a hidden chamber where the walls themselves seemed to weep and murmur, where the voices of the departed rose in dreadful chorus. "Do not linger where the stones breathe," he had scrawled in a frantic hand. "Those who listen too long are claimed by the silence." Elodie read the journal by candlelight, her pulse quickening with every page. Rationality told her it was superstition, a fabrication of a weary laborer driven mad by darkness. Yet something in those words called to her. What if it was real? What if the past truly could speak? And if it could, wasn't it her duty as a historian to hear it? Her obsession sharpened into resolve. She began tracing the gravedigger's crude maps, overlaying them with modern diagrams of the catacombs. She spent sleepless nights cross-referencing names, dates, and forgotten routes. Soon, her notebooks were filled with lines, sketches, and theories. Her apartment floor littered with maps, spread out like a general preparing for war. The world above became a distraction. Colleagues worried about her. Friends drifted away, but Elodie barely noticed out to her. There was only one truth left to uncover. The Chamber of Voices was real, and it was waiting for her. The night Elodie chose to begin her descent was cold and damp, the kind of night when Paris seemed to exhale mist through its cobblestone streets. Midnight bells echoed faintly from the churches above as she slipped through a narrow alley, her backpack heavy with supplies, a flashlight, spare batteries, a flask of water, the gravedigger's journal, and a map she had redrawn 100 times. In her pocket, she carried a small pendant her grandfather once gave her. Her keepsake, she told herself, would protect her from harm. The entrance was hidden, just as the journal had described, a crumbling iron gate tucked behind the ruins of an abandoned building. The authorities had sealed it years ago, welding thick bars across its frame, but cataphiles had pried open a gap just wide enough for a body to slip through. Elodie hesitated, her breath fogging in the air, and for the briefest moment, she wondered if she should turn back. But the pull of the chamber was stronger than fear. She crouched low, squeezed through the gap, and stepped into darkness. The first thing that struck her was the silence. Paris, even in its quietest hours, always hummed with life-distant traffic, laughter spilling from bars, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But down here, there was nothing. Only the echo of her own breathing and the crunch of gravel beneath her boots. The tunnel smelled of earth and stone, mingled with a faint metallic taste that reminded her of rust or perhaps blood dot. As she descended deeper, the air grew colder, and moisture dripped steadily from the ceiling, each drop amplifying in the stillness like a ticking clock. The beam of her flashlight cut through the black, illuminating rows upon rows of bones. Skulls were stacked neatly into walls, hollow eye sockets gazing at her with eternal accusation. Femurs formed tidy patterns, the morbid architecture of death. To Elodie, it was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a library of mortality, each bone a page in history's forgotten book. Her map guided her through narrow corridors and sudden intersections, each turn carefully marked in her notes. Still, she could feel the weight of disorientation pressing against her. The catacombs had swallowed countless explorers. Their bodies never recovered, their lights extinguished in endless night. She forced herself to breathe steadily, repeating a mantra in her mind. Follow the map. Follow the journal. Don't lose focus. Hours passed in this underworld, though time was difficult to measure without the sun or stars. At one point, she paused to sip water, her flashlight beam trembling as fatigue began to settle in. It was then that she noticed something unnerving. The silence was no longer complete. Somewhere deep within the labyrinth, a faint sound pulsed, a rhythm too irregular to be dripping water, too distant to be her own footsteps. It came and went like a sigh, as though the tunnels themselves were breathing. Elodie's heart quickened. The journal had warned of strange sensations, of noises without source, of walls that seemed alive. She clenched the leather book tightly in her hand, drawing strength from its words even as dread coiled tighter in her chest. With a shaky breath, she pressed forward, her light flickering across inscriptions carved into the stone. Some were dates, some were names, but others were warnings etched in hurried hands. Ni continuez, do not continue, I else murmurant, they whisper. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she traced the forbidden path. Every step felt heavier, as though unseen hands were pushing her back. Yet she could not stop. She had come too far, and the chamber was close. She could feel it, like a presence waiting in the dark. For the first time, Elodie wondered if she was descending not into history, but into a trap. Elodie had grown used to the silence, For hours, her world had been reduced to the steady crunch of her boots, the faint hiss of her breath, and the occasional drip of unseen water striking stone. She had almost convinced herself that the catacombs, for all their ominous reputation, were nothing more than a tomb of bones and echoes. But as she turned down a narrow passage, her flashlight beam dancing over skulls stacked like bricks, the silence broke. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a fleeting tremor in the air, a sound softer than a sigh. She froze, straining to hear, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound returned, a faint murmur, distant yet unmistakable. She flicked her flashlight around, its beam slicing across empty corridors and walls of bone. Nothing moved, no wind stirred, yet the murmur persisted. Then, chillingly, it spoke her name, Elodie. It was so faint that she thought she must have misheard it. She whispered to herself that it was the echo of her own breath, the tricks of exhaustion, or the memory of her grandfather's voice buried deep in her mind. But when it came again, clearer this time, it scraped across her nerves like a blade. Her blood ran cold. No one knew she was here. No one could have followed her this deep. She stood rooted to the spot, every muscle tense, her flashlight trembling in her grip. She remembered the journal, the words scrawled by that long-dead gravedigger: "Do not answer the dead, for they crave only the warmth of the living." And yet, she wanted to. Her lips parted before she could stop herself, the question forming in a shaky whisper: "Who's there?" The moment the words left her mouth, the atmosphere changed. The air thickened, heavy and damp, pressing against her chest, as though the tunnels themselves were exhaling. The whisper multiplied, no longer one voice, but many layered, overlapping, too many to count. Some sobbed, some moaned, others screamed in anguish so raw it pierced her bones. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it made no difference. The sound was inside her head, vibrating in her skull. Her flashlight flickered violently, the beam cutting in and out. Each stutter of darkness felt alive, as though the black itself reached toward her, pulsing with the rhythm of the whispers. She stumbled forward, desperate to escape the corridor, her breath ragged, her hands shaking. The voices followed. Every step she took, they grew louder, until it felt as though the walls themselves were speaking. She pressed her back against the damp stone, her eyes wild, the journal slipping from her hand to the floor. She tried to tell herself it was the strain of exhaustion, the tricks of her mind amplified by the suffocating dark. But the way her name slithered through the air, repeated again and again in tones that shifted from pleading to mocking, left her no comfort. For the first time since she entered the catacombs, Elodie felt true fear, not of getting lost, not of running out of light, but of something far worse, the realization that she was no longer alone. And deep down, beneath her terror, another thought took root, a whisper that was hers, yet not hers. "They have been waiting for you." The whispers pulled her forward, whether out of terror or compulsion, Elodie could not say. Her flashlight, now dimming with each flicker, carved a weak cone of light into the endless dark, guiding her steps as if it too were being led by unseen hands. The tunnel sloped downward, narrower with each turn, the air colder and heavier, until every breath felt like inhaling water. The voices thickened with the air, layer upon layer of grief, rage, and hunger. She stumbled once, catching herself against the wall, and recoiled when her palm pressed into something damp. When she lifted her hand, she saw faint streaks of red staining her skin. The stone bled. The corridor widened suddenly, and Elodie stepped into a cavernous space that swallowed her flashlight's beam. For the first time since she entered the catacombs, she felt the sheer scale of the underworld pressing against her. A chamber vast enough to hold a cathedral, yet suffocated by silence that vibrated with menace. Her light skittered across the walls, and her breath hitched. The bones here were not stacked in the neat, orderly patterns she had passed before. They were arranged deliberately, almost ritualistically. Skulls were embedded into spirals that wound across the chamber's walls, their empty sockets staring inward toward the center. Femurs and ribs formed lattice, twisting into symbols she didn't recognize, as if some ancient hand had woven death itself into art. And at the heart of the chamber lay a pool of stagnant black water, so still it mirrored her trembling form, as though she gazed into a dark twin of herself. Her flashlight trembled in her grasp, the beam hovering over the water's surface. Ripples formed, though she had not moved closer. The ripples spread outward, then reversed, pulling inward, as though the pool were inhaling. Elodie's breath caught in her throat, The voices surged, echoing from the walls, rising in a dreadful chorus. The skulls themselves seemed to vibrate, their teeth chattering in rhythm with the whispers. She staggered closer despite herself, compelled by something she could not name. The air grew colder with every step, the kind of cold that reached beyond skin into marrow. Her chest tightened, her breath frosting in the beam of her light. When she reached the edge of the pool, she saw faces in its depths, translucent, distorted, their mouths open in eternal screams. They rose and dissolved with the ripples, vanishing only to return again. Closer each time, Elodie collapsed to her knees, clutching the journal to her chest. The gravedigger's frantic warning flashed in her mind. Do not linger where the stones breathe. But the stones did more than breathe. They spoke, they beckoned, they accused. The voices clawed at her mind, whispering secrets she could not bear to hear, confessions of murders, betrayals, lost souls, abandoned to rot in silence. Her flashlight sputtered and went out. Darkness fell, absolute and suffocating. And in that perfect blackness, the voices no longer whispered. They screamed. For a moment, there was nothing but blackness. The failure of her flashlight left Elodie suspended in absolute void, her lungs seizing as though the air itself had been stolen. She could hear nothing but the thunder of her own heartbeat. Yet in that silence, she felt it a shift in the air, a presence pressing close. The chamber seemed to breathe around her, each inhalation a cold draft against her cheek, each exhalation heavy enough to sink into her bones. She whispered to herself, desperate, her voice cracking, "It's not real, it's not real." But the catacombs had other plans. The first touch came as a brush of icy fingertips across her wrist. She jerked violently, slamming her back against the wall of skulls. Their brittle teeth scraped her jacket, as if grinning at her panic. Her hand shook uncontrollably as she fumbled for the spare flashlight in her pack. But before she could find it, another touch grazed the back of her neck, soft, lingering, impossibly real. She spun, swinging her arm through the air, but there was nothing to strike. Nothing visible. Then came more. A hand against her shoulder, fingers curling into her hair, the sensation of nails grazing her throat with deliberate slowness. Each phantom caress was colder than the last, as if every spirit was leeching warmth from her skin. She felt them circling her, brushing past her legs, tugging at her clothes. She dropped to her knees, clutching her chest, gasping as the cold seeped inside. In a frenzy, she yanked out the spare flashlight, thumb trembling on the switch. A beam of weak light burst forth, cutting through the suffocating black. What it revealed stole the scream from her lungs. The chamber was alive. From the spirals of bones, shapes had begun to emerge. Faces formed in the pale skulls, their jaws opening and closing in silent cries. Translucent figures oozed from the walls like smoke given form, half human, half shadow, their features twisted in eternal agony. They hovered inches from her, their bodies wavering in the beam of her light. But their eyes were hollow, black pits that drank in everything. She staggered backward, her light shaking wildly across the chamber. Wherever it landed, figures stirred. Hands reached from the surface of the pool, pale and skeletal, clawing at the air as if desperate to pull themselves free. Ripples spread outward with every grasp, the water churning though nothing fully emerged. And all around her the voices grew louder. No longer a chorus of whispers, but a cacophony of wails and screams that reverberated in her skull. One voice pierced through them, all sharp, guttural, commanding. It rasped her name again. Elodie. Her legs gave out. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam spinning across the chamber, briefly illuminating the grotesque spiral of bones before landing on her pale face. She could no longer tell where the touches ended and where her own trembling began. Hands pressed at her from every side, cold palms on her arms, her shoulders, her face, each one pleading, demanding, begging her not to leave. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her voice a broken whisper. Please, stop. But the dead had no mercy. Their hunger was older than time, and they had finally found someone to feed upon. The hands did not withdraw. They lingered on her skin, some icy, some burning, some so faint they felt like breath. Elodie's body trembled violently, but the paralysis was not just fear. It was something deeper, as though her willpower itself was being unraveled, strand by strand. The cacophony of screams that had threatened to shatter her mind began to shift. Slowly, the cries softened, reshaping into something more deliberate. The chaos thinned until a strange harmony remained, hundreds of voices speaking at once, layered but clear, like a choir that had finally found its rhythm. And then they spoke to her. Stay. The voices whispered, the sound vibrating through her chest. Stay with us. We remember. We know what was hidden. Her hands pressed desperately against her ears, but it made no difference. The sound was within her, bypassing flesh and bone, resonating directly in her thoughts. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaking her face, and shook her head violently. No, I'm not supposed to listen. Yet the voices were patient, persuasive. They wept to her of betrayal, of soldiers buried alive beneath Paris during revolutions, of mothers who had their children torn from their arms during plague years, of prisoners executed in silence. They whispered confessions of noblemen whose crimes had been erased from history, of murders that never reached the surface world. Each word dripped with truth, truths too ugly for daylight, truths only the dead could carry. You came to us because you want to know. They said, we can show you everything. The secrets of kings, the sins of priests, the cries that Paris buried beneath its cobblestones. Every voice is here, Elodie, and they will be yours to keep. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, torn between horror and the ache of temptation. This was what she had always wanted, wasn't it? To hear the past speak, to pull history out of shadow and into the light. She had spent years chasing the forgotten, unearthing fragments no one else cared to touch. And now, here it was, offered freely, the past itself begging her to listen. But beneath the temptation, there was another note, darker and more insidious. Their chorus was not only promise but hunger. The way they said her name did not feel like invitation, but possession. They were not giving, they were taking. Every word slithered into her thoughts, tightening like chains. Her pendant slipped from her collar, swinging in the beam of her fallen flashlight. For a heartbeat, she latched onto it, clutching the cool metal as though it could shield her. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. The dead cannot speak, Elodie. If they do, it is because they want something from you. She clenched her jaw, forcing a ragged shout into the chamber. What do you want from me? The answer came instantly, a unified cry that shook the very stones. We want your voice. The walls trembled, the pool rippled violently, the skulls chattered their teeth in grotesque unison, and for the first time Elodie understood the true meaning of the chamber of voices. These whispers were not history calling to her, they were the dead feeding, reaching for her life to add to their eternal chorus. The chamber seemed to come alive with their demand. We want your voice, they howled, the words cascading in waves until the very walls vibrated with sound. The spirals of skulls rattled against one another, teeth clacking like the percussion of some ancient, terrible hymn. The stagnant pool erupted into motion, bubbles rising as if something deep below was struggling to reach the surface. Elodie stumbled backward, her hands pressed hard against her ears. But the voices were not in her ears anymore. They were inside her head, behind her eyes, reverberating through the hollow of her chest. Her flashlight rolled on the uneven ground, its beam spinning wildly across the chamber. Every sweep of light revealed new horrors. Figures lurched from the spirals of bones, their forms twisting and collapsing like smoke made flesh. They crawled toward her, dragging themselves across the floor with jerking, unnatural motions. Their faces stretched open, mouths agape, as if screaming, but no sound came from them. The voices remained inside her, echoing in maddening harmony, each syllable cutting into her mind like broken glass. Give it to us, give it to us. Elodie dropped to her knees, clutching her throat. Her own breath had begun to falter, every exhale stolen by the suffocating weight of the chamber. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Terror surged through her as she realized the truth. They weren't just asking for her voice, they were already taking it. Every second she lingered, the whispers grew louder, and her own thoughts grew fainter. Her identity was unraveling, thread by thread, replaced by the endless sorrow of the dead. She clawed at the stone floor, her nails breaking against the damp rock, dragging herself toward the edge of the chamber. But wherever she looked, the figures were there, closing in. From the pool, pale hands erupted, skeletal and slick, grasping blindly for her legs. She kicked free, sobbing. But another set of hands reached from the darkness, curling around her ankle. The chill of their touch burned, searing straight into her bones. No, she gasped, her voice hoarse, weak. She tried to shout louder, to fight, but the sound barely escaped her lips. The voices mocked her, repeating the fragments of her words in a chorus that grew louder, sharper, until they drowned her out entirely. Her vision blurred. The chamber tilted and swayed. Shadows stretched across the ceiling, twisting into shapes that looked like faces, thousands of them. stacked upon one another, mouths open wide. They were not waiting for her, they were consuming her. Her flashlight flickered once more, then died completely. The darkness swallowed her whole, and in that abyss, the screams became unbearable. Elodie curled against the wall, her hands pressed to her mouth as if to hold her voice inside, to keep it from being stolen. But the voices laughed, their tones mocking, triumphant. For the first time, Elodie understood she could not endure much longer. Her body trembled violently, her breaths shallow and ragged. Every nerve screamed for her to flee, but her legs refused to move. She had reached the limit, her breaking point. If she did not escape now, she knew with certainty she would never leave the catacombs. Not as herself, not as anything human. And in the crushing blackness, one final thought seared through her mind, a realization so sharp it nearly stopped her heart. This was never about discovering the past. This was about becoming part of it. Her trembling fingers fumbled for the one object that still tethered her to sanity. The gravedigger's journal. It had slipped from her pack earlier, but she found it by touch in the darkness. The cracked leather cover, slick with condensation. She clutched it to her chest like a lifeline, then pulled it open, the pages damp and fragile beneath her hands. With the chamber pressing in around her, she forced herself to write, desperate to leave some trace of her final moments, some proof that she had been here and that the whispers were real. Her flashlight was dead, so she wrote by feel, her pen scratching across the paper in jagged lines. Her handwriting, once elegant and precise, now lurched across the page in uneven strokes, words tumbling from her mind faster than she could contain them. Tears smeared the ink, but still she wrote. She had too. The voices are real. They are everywhere. They know me. They have spoken my name, again and again. They are inside my head. I cannot shut them out. They do not rest. They do not forgive. Her breath hitched as the air grew colder. Shadows pressed against her shoulders, icy hands tugging at her wrists, trying to drag the pen from her grasp. She fought to continue, biting her lip until blood filled her mouth. Her words turning frantic, desperate. They promise secrets. They offer knowledge, things no living person should know. Murders, betrayals, forgotten sins. They want me to stay. They want me to join them. The journal shook in her grip as another hand brushed against her face, cold and insistent. She sobbed, ink splattering across the page, her script collapsing into near Her mind felt like a rope, fraying strand by strand, each whisper unraveling another piece of her. Still, she scrawled the last fragments of thought she could cling to. Do not follow. Do not come here. The stones breathe, the dead speak, and they will take you. They are taking me now. They want. The pen slipped from her grasp. Her hand jerked violently, not by her will but by theirs. The last line broke off mid-word, the ink streaking across the page as if wrenched from her fingers. The chamber roared with laughter, hundreds of voices rising in cruel triumph. Elodie tried to scream, but her throat caught on silence. Her voice, the very essence of her, was being pulled away, siphoned into the chorus of the dead. Her lips moved soundlessly, her breath shaking, her tears falling onto the journal that lay open on the damp stone floor. The whispers echoed the fragments of her thoughts, mocking them, twisting them until they no longer belonged to her. The journal fell shut with a hollow slap as unseen hands tore it from her grip. Flinging it aside, it landed near the tunnel's entrance, waiting like bait for whoever might one day stumble upon it. In her final moments of clarity, Elodie realized the cruel design of the Chamber of Voices, not to trap explorers forever within, but to leave behind just enough evidence, just enough lure to draw the next soul deeper into its grasp. Her last sound was not a scream, but the faint rasp of breath being stolen, devoured, added to the chorus. And then, Elodie's voice was no longer her own. Days passed before anyone noticed Elodie was missing. She had withdrawn from the world so completely in her obsession that only a few colleagues wondered where she had gone. When she failed to appear for a lecture she had promised to give at the university, a half-hearted search began. Authorities checked her apartment, finding it littered with maps of the catacombs, journals filled with frantic sketches, and the name of La Chambre des Voix scrawled dozens of times in the margins. It was clear to them she had gone underground. The official search lasted less than a week. The catacombs, vast and unstable, were treacherous even for trained rescue teams. Entire corridors had collapsed. Others were so narrow that a person could crawl for hours before realizing they were lost. The police retrieved what they could, but as with so many before her, Elodie Moreau's trail vanished in the endless dark. Her name was added to a growing list of the missing, but the journal she carried was found. It lay near one of the sealed entrances, its final pages smeared with frantic handwriting that no one could fully decipher. The last words chilled even the hardened investigators. "They are taking me now. They want." The sentence ended abruptly, a long streak of ink dragging across the page as though torn from her hand. Rumors spread quickly, carried first among the tight-knit community of cataphiles, and then to the wider world. Some said her body had been taken by the water that pooled in the chamber. Others whispered that she had never left the catacombs at all, that her voice had been stolen and added to the eternal chorus beneath Paris. A few claimed to have heard it for themselves. Explorers who, while trespassing into forbidden sections, swore they heard a woman's voice calling their names, pleading for help. Just before their lights began to flicker. Above, life in Paris continued. Cafes filled with laughter, the Seine glittered under the lights, and lovers strolled across bridges as though nothing had changed. Yet in certain neighborhoods, residents spoke of unease. On quiet nights, when the city's hum softened, they claimed to hear something faint beneath their feet. Not the rumble of the metro or the creak of pipes, but whispers, murmurs that rose from the ground like smoke, curling through the cracks in the stone. Sometimes, if one listened closely enough, a single name could be heard, carried in the murmur. Sometimes Elodie's, sometimes their own. The authorities dismissed these tales as superstition, insisting that catacombs were nothing more than a historical site plagued by urban legends. But the journal remained locked away in police archives, its smeared words and frantic warnings never released to the public. Perhaps it was fear of inspiring more reckless explorers, or perhaps it was because some who read the final entry admitted, in private, that they too heard a faint whisper while turning the pages. Beneath Paris, the chamber of voices waits. Its walls breathe, its water stirs, and its chorus grows louder with every lost soul it claims. Elodie Moreau's story ended in the silence of the catacombs, but her voice, like the others, did not vanish. It lingers, calling to the living, waiting for someone else foolish enough to answer. And above, in the glittering city of light, the people of Paris walk unknowingly over a kingdom of shadows, a kingdom that is never still, never silent, a kingdom that hungers